podcast 8. Today I'm joined by former Labour Cabinet Minister Hazel Blears, who currently works very closely with us in Copeland, namely on projects like the Well Whitehaven project and other areas where she advises the council and works with a future opportunities group of local industry leaders that I work with. I'm also delighted to be joined by Henri Murison from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and I'll ask Henri in a moment to explain exactly what the Northern Powerhouse Partnership is and what it does. And of course, we've got Jamie Reid, former MP for Copeland for 12 years, and now the Stakeholder Relations Manager at Sellafield. So welcome all three of you to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us. Henri, I might as well come to you straight away. You know, if you could give the viewers an insight into exactly what the Northern Powerhouse Partnership is and what it does.
So we're I suppose the best way of describing us is the kind of voice of the North's business and civic leaders on a kind of pan-northern basis. And clearly, West Cumbria is a very important part of the North. And I think that the challenge and opportunity, I suppose, coming out of this crisis is how do we build a recovery for all, not just geographically, but across all of our communities and our society, because we already had some fundamental divides. It was only a few months ago we were talking in the general election about working to man, and I would argue working to woman, if not much more important, or at least as equally important. And that whole debate about how you level up the country, which is of huge importance to communities across Cumbria, but particularly on the west, has not gone away. And the reality is we're not going to get the money twice to rebuild from this crisis and to close those fundamental societal divides, which are also economic scars, right? Because if we want to have an economy that's able to succeed in the future, we need to be able to generate real value. And I think this economy that we have now in this country has been demonstrated to be based on pretty weak foundations. And in a sense of what's happening in our global economy, having very little interest in your significant advanced manufacturing base, not having made the most of the energy assets you have, just as two examples, is being proved to be a pretty short-term strategy for any economy. Because in reality, what this whole period has shown us is the importance of the economic fundamentals. And so, yes, we've rightly talked about our key public sector workers, but those in our power stations, those who are keeping the lights on, those in our manufacturing supply chains who are keeping essential products flowing into our online distribution warehouses and into businesses that have got critical importance to our lives. Hopefully that's reminded people of those that make our lives possible. And it's not all about services. It's much more about the types of economic opportunities and activity that actually take place here in the North, and particularly in Cumbria.
Thank you very much, Henri. Hazel, I'll come to you. You know, we've gone through, since March the 23rd, quite, what seems a long time now in lockdown. How do you feel that's gone and the community response to lockdown?
Well, first of all, I think people have actually been amazing during this lockdown period. They've really heeded the messages that government has been putting out about staying at home and keeping people safe and protecting our NHS. I think people have been incredibly disciplined, but it's been really, really hard. And it's been especially hard for people who haven't got a lot of money, and perhaps they don't have a garden, they're living in a flat with a couple of children. Maybe they're desperately worried about whether or not they're going to have a job when this is all over. So as well as all the lockdown troubles, the pressures on families are absolutely enormous. And I think this has highlighted, once again, the inequalities between people. If you're relatively comfortable, and many of us are, then lockdown's a very different proposition than if you're really at the sharp end. And one of the things that's worried me the most is that domestic violence has gone up dramatically during this period. So families feeling that pressure, it boils over into violence. And I just can't imagine what it's like to be absolutely in the middle of that. We've got fabulous community organisations up there, Well Whitehaven, everything happening on the Murison estate. People are amazingly resilient. The women out west who are helping with the issues around domestic violence, supported by yourself and the council. People have pulled together. But my sense at the moment is it's just fraying a bit at the edges. And therefore, when we're moving out of lockdown, we've got to be really, really careful that we do it safely. My dad's 90, my mum-in-law's 93. They're both very worried about there being a second peak of infection. So I think this is going to require some really careful, thoughtful thoughtful decision, not knee-jerk reaction, but really thinking about the implications. But for me, the big message is that, you know, people are living really hard lives. They've been left behind before, and coming out of this, we have got to make sure that that inequality gap is closed and we don't leave people even more left behind.
Jamie, you know, you live right in the heart of the community. What's your observations of the lockdown period and the community response to supporting residents through this, what's been a really challenging period?
I think I'd definitely repeat a lot of what Hazel just said there, but you know, working with yourself, Mike, and with the county council, I think we've seen some of the very best of what our community is able to do in times of real stress and crisis. Actually, I think some of the volunteer efforts have been remarkable, both with local charities, with new organisations who just set up to meet the need, whether it be food distribution or the distribution of care packages and the provision of those as well, the purchasing of those and the distribution of those has been in many ways really admirable. But for those of us that live in and know the community, we're not that surprised by that. We've come together through adversity before, and we do rally to the standard when we need to, and we've done that, and it's been heartening and it's been impressive. I've got to say, I think it's been typical of West Cumbrians, but beyond those kinds of feelings, yeah, there's a determination that when this gets back to normal, you know, we've got to do it better, and we've got to get this right, and I think we all feel like that.
Yeah, I think, you know, while you're on, Jerry, I think it's got to go on the record. A lot of what Sellafield do in the community, and not just the employment to provide, but right throughout this crisis, Sellafield have absolutely stood up and supported the volunteer efforts in both financially, with manpower, and I can't really overstate the positive impact and the difference that's made in the community, and I think you've dragged others with you. So, you know, on behalf of the community, I'd like to sort of put on record to thank Sellafield for all that they are doing in this period. But, you know, to take us on to another point, you know, we've got to look ahead, and we've got to look at coming out of lockdown, and Cymru has been particularly hard hit. But a lot of people's going to be looking to Sellafield now. You know, you're the biggest employer, you've got the biggest supply chain, and it's the sort of actions and the measures. So do you want to give us a little bit of an update on where you are as we prepare for whatever the Prime Minister's going to say on Sunday for moving out of lockdown?
Well, absolutely. So the footprint of Sellafield, you know, 58.8%, nearly 60% of all jobs directly and indirectly in Copeland, pushing 30% in Allerdale, I think, as well. We well and truly understand our footprint and our importance in the local economy, and all that stems from that as well. Supply chain's been very supportive of what we've been doing through this period as well, and hats off to them. We've begun this week a progressive restart of operations, fewer than 250 people to date, mainly going back to work in offices where they can't work from home, where they have needed to access certain hardware and software to help with design work for some of the major high hazard projects on our site. And we'll be progressively restarting operations in the weeks and months ahead, but it's not going to be overnight, Mike. It's going to take a long time to do this. We'll only do it when it's safe to do so. And the work that we've restarted to date is the kind of work that can be dialed down again, if you like, if external situations determine that we need to do that. I think it's worth pointing out we've had over 1,000 people working on the Sellafield site since the lockdown. People who are necessarily working to keep us safe and secure on the site. And we hope to increase that in the coming weeks and months. But I think the wider context of what this means for not just our supply chain, but for the Cumbrian economy is a point really, really well made. We need to think, I think, collectively about what we can all do about the economic recovery, and there's some real challenges in there going ahead. We already know that there's an over-reliance in West Cumbria, and probably Cumbria as a whole, on Sellafield. And we need to help to do all we can to diversify our economic base. I'd also say that we're over-reliant on the public pound as well. We need to significantly increase our if you like, our private economy. Of course, there's only one economy, public and private, but we are over reliant on public spending in our part of the world. So the big challenges that we already knew were there are going to be thrown into even more sharp relief when we start to begin the economic recovery effort, and that's something which is going to require all of us to put all of our weight behind.
Absolutely. Hazel, your social investment company has done a report on the economic impact, and Cumbria, our part of the world, has been particularly hard by the virus. I think the infection rate per head of population is as bad here as anywhere in the UK. But we're going to be hit hard financially. So this planning that Jamie's talking about is very important going forward. We can't sort of wait for lockdown to end before we start planning how we're going to address moving forward.
Absolutely right. And for many of us, the last few years, we've actually been thinking about these issues, particularly the point that Jamie makes about diversification. Because when I first came up here, I was surprised to find that, the wages of the people who've got good jobs are really high. I think it's the third highest outside Mayfair. And yet there are so many people who are struggling at the same time just to get a basic standard of living. So there's a big inequality in terms of the opportunities that are available to people. And the data set that the social investment business has got is based on the impact of coronavirus. And it's the transactions that are happening in every local economy, literally at ward level. And it's a graphic illustration. The places like the cafes, the restaurants, the leisure opportunities, they've just gone off a cliff. So if you compare not just Whitehaven, but Cumbria as a whole, and South Lakes in particular, that tourist industry, which is the lifeblood at this time of year with this wonderful weather, all of that has just disappeared. So there's a lot of parallels between places like Cumbria and Cornwall. They're on a limb, the transport links are not brilliant, they're dependent on particular bits of the economy, whether it is Sellafield or whether it's tourism. And so all of these big economic drivers are now even more in the frame. And for me personally, I think what Sellafield's done around young people has been fantastic. The apprenticeships, giving people not just a job, but a career and a future. And particularly the young women who've gone into some very complex scientific manufacturing apprentices, they've been really imaginative. But for me, I think this next period is about young people, because they're starting off in life. When I left college, there were opportunities to do things. If that's closed down, those young people are going to leave even more than they do now. And we need them to stay in Cumbria to contribute to our economy. So the bus station, which is, happening in Whitehaven, I think it's a fabulous example. It's going to be a place for young tech, digital startups, the kind of thing that young people in Whitehaven have been saying to me, all the time. They want to live here, but they want something exciting to do. And I'm working now on the Future High Streets Fund bid with the council, with yourselves, to try and see if we can, bid for some government money, not in a kind of way of please give us money, but we're a fantastic place. We've got loads of ideas. We've got great people. And I think that idea of, Whitehaven being, a go-to place. It's got the harbour, it's got the coastal bit, everything. So, the government, I've got a message to the government, really. If you've got money to spend it in the places that were left behind, because otherwise they're not just going to be left behind, they're going to be falling off a cliff. So the levelling up agenda for me is now more urgent, and it needs to be done on a bigger scale. And, Whitehaven really's got to have that high streets regeneration money in place to make that difference.
Well, I think that is looking promising, and the bids are ready to submit, and hopefully with that will go forward on schedule. Henri, the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, how are you going to support us to with the diversification that Jamie talked about, that we desperately need and talked about for many years, going back, and to really kickstart or restart the Cumbrian and West Cumbrian economies?
No, I think that both Jamie and Hazel make exactly the right arguments, right, about the type of economy that you want to create and what that delivers for the country, not just what it delivers for West Cumbria. And I mean, Sellafield is the perfect example, right, of a contribution that that your part of the world, a part of the world I'm very fond of, makes to the nation. And I think you can have a big part in many other stories as well, whether it's in how we decommission the rest of our nuclear establishment, whether it's how we get into small modular reactors. These are things people understand well in West Cumbria because of all that nuclear heritage. But the people who build the bits that go into Sellafield, the supply chain in all its different forms, can also lend their capacity and capabilities to challenges in the wider energy field, and to lots of other opportunities that aren't directly tied to the nuclear industry. And so I think that there was almost this kind of misnomer that you put your kind of all your eggs in a kind of Moorside shaped basket and then everything will be okay. And I think we've learned the lessons from that, which is that those who come promising kind of solutions that are gift wrapped, usually it's more complicated than all of that, right? And actually, you're going to have to do lots of different things to get the type of economy that we need. And I think what we would kind of diagnose, and we talk very much, and we've been thinking about what a recovery for all would look like, and are doing lots of work at the moment on how that would work. I've got, I think, a few offers for a place like West Cumbria. I think that fibre to the premises and connectivity is really important. And I think communities like West Cumbria would have been bottom of the queue to get that, because actually it's not like the Orkney Islands where there's no internet connectivity, but it's also not like a major city in one of the bigger conurbations where they would get these things anyway as a market. So making sure we can accelerate that to get the benefits of that for local business and for communities, I think is really important. It's also something that employs lots of people who might otherwise be displaced from other parts of the economy, and is something that can generate jobs quickly. Because that's the other challenge we've got, is that we don't just need infrastructure projects tomorrow, jam tomorrow. I think it's how people rightly often criticise the talks of the kind of grand projet. But the reality is even the most grand of projet, like an HS2, have jobs in them now. Do you mean there are supply chain jobs for phase one now? And what we need to do is make those big schemes into manageable chunks that local SMEs can take advantage of, so that when we do as a country invest in infrastructure in the long term, which I think we will do coming out of this crisis, we use that to create jobs now. And I think that the kind of future jobs fund approach of the last recession was very valuable, but there wasn't really a legacy from it. There was a bit of a social legacy, but it was a relatively small one. And I was someone who's a big proponent, right, of the future jobs fund. So this is, I'm not criticising it. What I'm saying, I suppose, is that actually doing some really big things that are meaningful and delivering tangible elements of them early to create jobs now is probably a more realistic proposition that will land better with the current government, alongside investing in R&D and more widely in science and some of the other areas that I think will have benefits. But I think the key bit is that those aren't separate to doing place-based regeneration, Mike. The reality is, if you want people to come to Whitehaven to work in some of those great businesses on the Westlake Science Park, you need to give them somewhere good to go and spend their money at the weekend. Does that make sense? And the West Country economy is bedeviled by the fact that it already has some of the most interesting leading businesses in the country and the world based there. The problem is they don't choose to live in Whitehaven. They don't choose to live in Millom. We've got to fix that. We've got to make these communities that can capture the value they generate, because actually West Cumbria's principal problem isn't that it doesn't have a dynamic economy that's going to be able to deal with the fact that over time Sellafield is going to be a smaller part of it anyway. We need to grow those other parts of the economy, but actually we can't do that and forget the fact that we actually need to capture more of the value that's generated locally anyway. And we have to do those two things in concert, because engaging with those significant opportunities to increase the productivity of the north and bringing that money back to West Cumbria is only valuable if that money doesn't go straight back out to the BMW garage, as a former chief exec at Sellafield used to say. And he's absolutely right, which is that what we want to do is to create value that stays in the West Cumbrian economy. And hopefully people will spend their pounds locally for the next few months, and they'll think about how they can put money in the pockets of their neighbours and friends who run local businesses. Because if they want there to be a local economy to use when we all come out of this lockdown fully, when social distancing is a distant memory, people are going to have to make personal choices to spend money in local businesses now. And that isn't just a job for the public sector, Mike, that's a job for everybody, right? Everyone needs to think, well, actually, yes, of course I'm making the occasional Amazon purchase. I'm a human being. I don't live in a northern dream bubble where I can obsess only on things that are made and produce value only in the north of England. But we could all do a little bit more to think about where those of us who are still making and earning and living spend our money. And if we spend that in local economies, then we're going to generate the same sort of value that Sellafield generates, putting its money into local supply chains. But everyone can be a little Sellafield. Does that make sense? Everyone can be clever about how they spend their own income. And whether you've got very little to spend or a lot to spend, the irony is that the people who have a little to spend usually spend it in their local economies. So people at the bottom of our social ladder tend to spend a lot more of their income generating value for them and their neighbours. If everyone spent money like those who often live on the lowest incomes, then economies like that in Copeland would be a lot more successful already. And coming out of this crisis, we need to understand some of those local economic factors, not just those big, mega global UK-wide domestic opportunities, because if you don't do both at the same time, you get some really awful distributional impacts, which is that we'll just create more prosperous, successful people in West Cumbria and not narrow the gap. And I think a lot of the time we spend looking at schools, how we can support those young people who've fallen behind at the moment with the educational challenges of being away from learning, that we know that we're going to have the biggest gap we've ever had in disadvantage, that children from the middle class homes will have done better at home than they probably did at school. And the kids from the most disadvantaged backgrounds will have completely fallen off a cliff. To take the kind of example from earlier in terms of places that Hazel gave, we need to think about families, we need to think about children, we need to think about high streets. We need to consider how those things all lock together, because none of those are islands, right? Our schools, our communities, our businesses are all dependent on each other, and keeping those institutions working and successful is vital for the whole of the West Cumbrian economy to succeed and have the opportunities it wants for its future. Because if we don't get this right, huge, significant chunks of it could disappear, and it's very hard to bring those back when you've lost them.
On the point of education, Jamie, you've been a real education advocate, in your previous role, and heavily involved in, it wasn't that long since we were celebrating the opening of a fantastic new campus in Whitehaven. It's got to be of a real concern, this long period of time with children not in education, not in school, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And we've developed the WELL project, Western Excellence in Leadership and Learning, which were funded at the tune of £1.8 million a year, I think, which is designed to help address those advantage gaps which Henri talks about. And massive respect to Henri and his team for some of the pioneering work they've done in this regard, taking reports to the Education Select Committee, having those recommendations about narrowing that gap accepted and more. But it requires all of us to step up, because there's not just one lever here that somebody's going to pull somewhere in Whitehall and solve these problems here in West Cumbria. That's not going to happen. You know that better than anybody, Mike. It's going to require a really broad kind of partnership-based approach. But the fundamental of our economy, the fundamentals rather, will only be addressed by focusing on this educational disadvantage. It's the only long-term route to get to where we want to be and get what we want from it. So we're going to carry on doing our bit. I think that other people have to start doing more, by the way. This can't just all fall on the shoulders of certain organisations, and it's not all down to local authorities either. I think the vast majority of educational attainment is determined in the home, just to echo Henri's point. Prior to this crisis, the vast majority of educational attainment is determined by what happens in the home. And so we do have, all of us, a job to do around the culture of education in our part of the world. It's not just something you've got to do because you've got to do it, and it's going to be difficult for mum and dad if you don't. I think we've got to be honest about this. I think we've got to be tough about it where we need to be tough about it, and we've got to really put this in the top 2 or 3 things about which we talk about in our routine discussions about how do we get Cumbria and West Cumbria where we want it to be. Look, good towns have good schools in them, and it's causal. These things aren't dislocated. And if you go and look at some of the massive steps, Hazel will be well placed to talk about this, some of the massive steps in the East End of London, or in some of the more rundown parts of Manchester over the past 10, 15 years, where you've seen social regeneration, where you've seen economies grow, and where you've seen these kinds of urban renaissance really taking hold, the schools are the first building block to getting there. It's the schools always come first. So education is it's the foundation of everything that we want to achieve. And for too long in our part of the world, we just frankly haven't believed that. And our friends and colleagues and family members in our towns and villages haven't believed that either. And they've always been wrong. And so we've got to change it.
I would agree. On Sunday, the Prime Minister's going to make an announcement on coming out of lockdown, and said Sellafield, you've already started a phased return to work. I think we should be under no illusion. It's not going to be easy to come out of lockdown because we've spent the last 8 to 10 weeks telling people to stay in and protect themselves, save lives. It's going to be difficult, isn't it?
It is going to be difficult. I think it's going to be much more difficult than the ramp down. Actually, I think the ramp up it's got so many more challenges in it. Obviously, we don't know what the PM is going to say, but I think it would be a very limited lifting of some minor restrictions. I think the lockdown's still going to stay in place, and I think the message will still be overwhelmingly, stay home, stay safe, protect the NHS. I think, and we're making it clear with our employees and supply chain partners that this is going to take months and months. It's not going to take weeks. This is a long haul project of real difficulty and complexity. So, get ready for this being a long haul.
Yeah. It's got a huge financial impact. I think we all realise that while things like furlough have been widely welcomed, it's unsustainable in the long term. It really is. And coming out of lockdown, we've got to balance the long-term danger to people's health by maintaining that lockdown too restrictive for too long.
Absolutely, Mike. And there's a report just been produced by people I know, Symmetrica, and they've worked with the LSE. And basically, they've been measuring the impact of the lockdown on people's sense of well-being, their quality of life, how do they feel. And one of the really stark statistics is obviously when you get made redundant, your well-being does go down. This lockdown has been the equivalent of twice the impact that you get when you're made redundant. So people's well-being has really plummeted. Again, it's a bit like the economy. It's mirroring the economy, how you feel. So actually the impact on people's mental health, the way that they're feeling about the world, the ambition that they've got for their families, all of those things have been affected by this completely unique situation that people have found themselves in. Anxiety levels are really high. It's going to take time for this to work its way through. And different people are going to need different levels of support. For some of us, quite resilient, got great families, we've got loads of support mechanisms. Other people don't have that. And it's not just about employment. It is about your network of friends, your community, the people who can help you through a tough time. Who do you ring up when you're feeling in a terrible state and, your kids are not doing what they should do, they're not doing their homework, they're not settling back into school. All of those issues are going to require us all to spend a great deal of time and care in what we do. And Henri, it was good to hear the Future Jobs Fund. I did that with James Pennell when we had the financial crash. But what we did was we put £1 billion into it. It was a big scheme. Yeah. But we said to local authorities that we would prioritise you and your bid if you came to us with a social enterprise partner, because we really wanted to build a different kind of economy that wasn't just the big public sector things, not just the big corporates, but really local community-based organisations who could get under the skin of some of these problems. And that sector is now growing in West Cumbria. We've got some great social enterprises. And I know that Jamie's doing all he can to try and get social enterprises into the supply chain. But I do think that, there is going to be a move, and it sounds a bit grand, but there's a lot of people now talking about a different way of doing business, changing a kind of, rapacious capitalism that's just about making profits into something that is more socially responsible. Sellafield, it's in their DNA, it's in their bloodstream, it's what they do. And therefore, I think they can be an example. And the supply chain, Morgan Sindel and Jacobs and people like that, they can be an example to some of the other bits of the economy. And Henri, I think, when we're talking to government about big investment, let's put some strings on it that says, yeah, we want the investment, but we want business to be done in a different way. I'm part of the co-op group, the food stores, the funerals, the insurance. We're a member-owned organisation. We've given £60 million back to local causes in the last 3 years, just to try and build that community capacity. And I think that a lot of the rest of the corporate sector, if they just go back to business as usual, will have missed a really important opportunity. Sometimes you have a crisis, and that can be an incentive to actually have a big shift to do your business in a different way. And I think if we don't grasp this, you know, and their responsibility to young people, to apprenticeships, to giving people a sense of a decent future, then it'll be such a missed opportunity. So this dialogue has got to go on, and we've got to get to some of the big decision makers. And a lot of people in traditional business, you know, they want to change. In some ways, they don't really know how. Well, they can learn from people who've already trod that path, and we could be, hopefully, be part of that.
One final quick question to all three of you, and I'll start with you, Hazel, as a former Minister for Local Communities and Local Government. The projections from the Cumbrian councils, the 7 councils in Cumbria, is the cost impact of the coronavirus crisis is going to be in the range of about £100 million, over and above what were already stretched budgets. Do you see this expediting a reform of local government, or will it be put on the back burner?
I think that the drive to get councils which are fit for purpose in terms of size, shape, membership, strategy, energy, will be even more important than it was before this crisis. And one of the things I regret is that local government haven't been more at the heart of this. I mean, local authorities have stepped forward, but I haven't had the sense that the government have really appreciated that where your delivery happens is local, local, local. Those are the people who can support communities through desperate circumstances. So I think that the kind of energy to reform local government will be even greater, because what you need is councils that are big enough to be able to provide really high quality services. And again, another tragedy of this crisis has been the care sector. You know, the NHS absolutely done a brilliant job, but the care sector, this has really highlighted the divisions between the National Health Service and a care sector that's primarily run for profit in many ways. We don't have a national care service, which we absolutely could do with. The people who work in the care sector, they've faced a horrendous situation, and yet they're some of the lowest paid workers in the economy. They don't have skills progression, they don't have a career option. You know, I think we badly let down our care sector, and now we've got the pandemic absolutely entrenched in care homes. So for me, if this isn't a wake-up call for the role of local government to be able to provide great education, great social services, look after their communities, and play a massive role, Henri, in supporting the Northern Powerhouse, the levelling up, the renewal of towns and communities, that's where local government has its absolute strength. But I'll tell you this, it needs to be well led, it needs to have capacity, drive, intellect, all of those things, Mike, that you've brought to Copeland. And, you know, if we can have that on a larger scale, then I think we really will have a big opportunity after this is over.
Henri, a big supporter of devolution. Do you see that coming quicker now?
So I think you'll see a Northern Growth Body to sort of get some of the kickstarting of the recovery, and I think we've advocated certainly that those mayoral devolution arrangements should come faster, not slower. Partly because around, and we'll do some more work on this at the moment, around the skills agenda. So linked to what Hazel was rightly picking up on around the kind of legacy of this and the sort of particularly the scarring of a generation of young people. How do we ensure that we give opportunities, whether they're training or employment, to as many people as possible, and do that in a way that uses the available funding as well as it can? At the moment, we don't have an effective system for doing skills at a sub-regional level in this country, apart from in areas like Greater Manchester or in the Liverpool City region where we've got metro mayors. We've got to solve that problem now very quickly. So I think there is definitely a cause for acceleration. And I think the challenge, isn't it, Mike, is that some of the things that would deal with the fundamental challenges of how local government works in Cumbria will take time. And I suppose the kind of what that pushes you towards is forms of collaboration that might not require kind of full structural change. Does that make sense? Because I think people coming together to work together is a lot faster than moving the structures around. Does that make sense? And I think how you and your colleagues might work collaboratively probably creates the footprint and the kind of the infrastructure for then doing those bigger structural changes. But I think certainly the government is still committed to the structures of devolution being made easier to access. But I think in the interim, certainly those areas that have got combined authorities, even if they don't have a mayor, will provide infrastructure to do things. And I think that getting on with creating some of that infrastructure in Cumbria and creating the building blocks for later devolution, I think is really critical. And I think that's something that your work and the work of like-minded colleagues has made a lot easier, because I think having that debate and having started to get the local authorities working together, and for instance, the close collaboration between Allerdale and Copeland, which you'd kind of think would be obvious, is now sort of at a level that's deeper and more meaningful than it's been for decades. And that's a testament really to your leadership and that of colleagues in Allerdale, who've very much taken a strategic view, which is that in reality you have common interests. As Jamie alluded to, you have a huge shared asset in Sellafield and the wider Sellafield supply chain, and how you leverage that asset economically but also socially and work together to build on that and to achieve greater successes, I think is exactly the right approach to take, particularly when it comes to economic development, where it literally makes no sense to work separately on the recovery, because what's good for Allerdale will be good for Copeland and vice versa. And I think if the political structures were a bit clearer, Mike, and you or another person was the Metro Mayor for Cumbria, this would all be a lot easier. And the government and the Prime Minister would be calling you every week to ask what he could do to support the redevelopment and the getting the Cumbrian economy back on track. And that slight inequality that someone is asking for Greater Manchester for that, and no one's speaking up for Cumbria, is certainly something that weighs heavily on my mind, that we need to speak up for the Cumbrias, the Lancashires, the Humber estuaries of this world, who have got huge parts to play in the recovery, but aren't necessarily at the forefront of policymakers in Whitehall's minds. And I think that as we reflect on VE Day today, we think about the very huge sacrifices people made and the huge economic dislocations caused by a conflict like that. In reality, coronavirus is horrific. It's horrific for so many families who've suffered. But what we can't do is allow us to have an economic impact that damages the lives of many, many more than have been affected by the virus itself. And how we work together to make sure we don't do long-term damage, particularly to a generation of young people, I think is something that will get local government leaders working together the way that you've been so able to work with your near neighbours and colleagues.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Jamie, you've probably got first-hand knowledge of how the disjointed approach of local councils across Cumbria has probably held us back for years.
Well, purely personal opinions, Mike. I couldn't, Sellafield wouldn't have a view on this.
Yeah, I understand that.
The need for change is overwhelming and long overdue, I think. I think, if you look at our great cities, whether it be Liverpool, Newcastle, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, and you look at the way that those cities used to be, still are, but used to be massive powerhouses, economic powerhouses, around the turn of the 19th century, 19th into the 20th century, driven by local government, driven by local leaders. And it was the kind of that municipal approach towards place building and economic growth, which essentially made Britain the economic powerhouse that we became and still are. So yeah, the need for change in Cumbria, in my personal view, is overwhelming. And it really is we've talked a lot about fundamentals today, but it is a fundamental requirement for us to get this economy, community, society where we want it to be.
Today, it's the 8th of May, VE Day. Hopefully in some form or another that can be celebrated and certainly recognised. And it the difficulties that we're going through now, it gives a little bit of context, as Henry pointed out. When it's nothing really to what people went through during the war period. So it's a really significant day, and I hope today that the celebrations of some form can take place around the place. Can we have a quick couple of lines off each of you to conclude today, Hazel?
Well, I know that local people on Murison are going to be celebrating in their usual fashion. So as far as they can in lockdown, they'll be waving their flags and just having that community spirit. But for me, after the war, there was a really big moment when people said, we don't want to go back to the old ways. We don't want the massive inequality between the haves and the have-nots. We established the National Health Service. We had a decent education for everyone. And, those fundamental building blocks of a civilized society came about after the war because people had seen the most horrendous things and they wanted to improve their world. Now, coronavirus is not the war. and we will come through it. But if there's just a bit of that kind of anger, really, that, you know, things can be better and things have got to be better than they have been in the past. People on 0 hours contracts with insecurity, living hand to mouth, you know, kids struggling to get a decent education. You know, I come from a working class background in Salford, and my mum and dad were education. They just drummed it into you, so that you could get on in life. And if we can capture that, a bit of that spirit, that post-war spirit, people did amazing things. You know, everybody said they couldn't do it, and they just rolled the sleeves up, got stuck in, and did it. So if we have a bit of that, you know, post-war spirit in us, working together, collaborating, we could do some miracles, I think, and really move the country forward and move Cumbria forward and Copeland forward.
Absolutely. Quick two-liner, Henri.
So I think my kind of my reflection would be, wouldn't it, which is that this is about how does the country come together without all the kind of traditional trappings, whether it's at a local level or a national level, and how do we take what has been a very significant coming together across society to put it to good use for the recovery, which I think is exactly what I would take from Hazel's point, which is that we have to understand the very differential impact this crisis has had on the most vulnerable in our society, and that those people are going to need real help to avoid them never recovering from this. And it is in all of our interests for them to recover financially, economically and socially. And we need to just fix that. We need to make sure this is a society that fixes that.
So, someone had a phone there. Jimmy.
Nothing to add really, Mike. Hope everybody takes the opportunity to get a bit of a well-earned break. It's been a pretty grueling 7 weeks and an incredible achievement. During Europe 75 years ago, we could spend another couple of podcasts talking about that, but I think the lessons of it are very well served in this current context.
Yeah, absolutely. Hazel Blears, Henri Murison, Jamie Reid, thank you all very much for joining us today. That's been a really informing debate, really interesting from my point of view, so I really appreciate you all taking time out to come on this morning. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.